start with a direct capacity comparison between China and Europe's energy storage systems, anchored in installed grid-scale battery data rather than abstract claims. A cause and effect chain moving from industrial policy decisions to manufacturing scale to grid deployment outcomes. Battery storage is functioning less as an energy transition tool and more as a state-directed buffer system that converts industrial overcapacity into grid control. Cold and methodical, just the facts with restrained interpretation. China didn't quietly lead the global battery race. It built a second electricity system on top of the first one. By the most conservative industry estimates available from 2024 to 2025 deployment tracking, China now operates well over 50 gigawatts of grid-scale battery storage, with expansion curves that are still steep rather than flattening. Europe, by contrast, sits somewhere in the low tens of gigawatts in operational battery storage when you aggregate across Germany, the UK, Italy, and Spain. Even if you stretch the definition and include every utility-scale installation in the European grid stack, you're still looking at a gap that is not incremental, it's structural. And the comparison gets sharper when you stop treating storage as a single category. Europe's grid flexibility has historically leaned on pumped hydro, water reservoirs acting as giant mechanical batteries. China has that too, in large volumes, but what matters here is the new layer. Electrochemical storage deployed at speed, tied directly to solar and wind expansion zones, often built alongside generation rather than after it. That sequencing difference matters more than the raw numbers. Because storage isn't just capacity, it is timing. It is how a grid behaves when demand and supply stop matching in real time. The uncomfortable detail is how fast China moved from pilot projects to industrial rollout. Around 2017 to 2019, grid-scale batteries were still demonstration assets, often subsidized experiments attached to renewable parks. Then, policy shifted. Provincial mandates began requiring storage ratios for new wind and solar installations. In plain terms, if you wanted to build generation, you also had to build flexibility. That one requirement turned storage from an optional technology into a forced companion industry. And once that happened, manufacturing kicked in. Chinese battery firms were already operating at scale in electric vehicles. The same supply chains, lithium iron phosphate chemistries, cell production lines, inverter systems, were redirected into stationary storage. No need to reinvent the industrial base, just reroute it. Europe, meanwhile, treated storage as a grid optimization problem. China treated it as an industrial output problem. That distinction explains why the curves diverge so sharply. If you look at grid behavior rather than capacity labels, something more subtle shows up. Chinese provinces like Inner Mongolia or Xinjiang are not just generating surplus renewable power. They are learning to absorb volatility internally. Excess wind at night doesn't travel hundreds of kilometers first. It gets buffered locally, then released when coastal demand peaks. Storage becomes a spatial stabilizer inside the country, not just a backup system. Europe's fragmentation makes that harder. Cross-border balancing exists, but it still depends heavily on transmission constraints and political coordination between states that don't always share the same energy priorities. So even when Europe builds storage, it often functions at the margin, shaving peaks, stabilizing frequency, rather than reshaping the entire flow of electricity across regions. My read is that the real shift here isn't about batteries at all. It's about what kind of system you become when you can absorb your own intermittency instead of negotiating with it every hour of the day. There's a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Europe's strategy has been more diversified, less reliance on a single chemistry or supply chain, more emphasis on interconnectors and demand response. That could age better if technology shifts again. But it also slows physical deployment. And in energy systems, delay compounds quietly until it doesn't. The question that keeps coming back is simple. If storage is now the missing layer between renewable generation and industrial reliability, what does it mean when one region builds it as infrastructure and another treats it as optimization? The data doesn't fully answer that yet, but the direction of travel is already visible, and it's not symmetrical. What matters next isn't the headline number of gigawatts. It's what those gigawatts are doing when nobody is looking. In China, grid-scale storage isn't sitting idle as a backup asset waiting for emergencies. It is increasingly embedded into daily dispatch decisions: which coal plants ramp down, which solar farms overproduce, which provinces export or absorb power at any given hour. That operational integration is the real shift. Not the hardware itself, but the fact that the grid has started to behave like a managed fluid system instead of a rigid pipeline. A useful reference point is State Grid Corporation of China's expansion strategy after 2021. They didn't just add renewables and then solve variability later. They built what internal policy documents often call new type power systems, meaning generation, storage, and transmission planned together from the start. That sequencing matters more than people usually admit in public analysis. Once you lock in generation first and try to retrofit storage later, you inherit constraints that get more expensive every year. Europe largely followed that retrofit path. Germany's Energiewende is the clearest example. Massive renewable expansion, especially wind in the north and solar in the south, but storage deployment lagged behind for years. The system compensated with gas peaker plants, interconnectors to neighbors like France and the Netherlands, and aggressive market-based balancing mechanisms. It worked, but it worked through constant adjustment, not structural absorption. Now compare that to what happened in provinces like Guangdong or Jiangsu. Industrial load centers paired with distributed storage are starting to smooth peak demand internally. Instead of importing stability from outside the system, they are manufacturing it inside the system boundaries. That's a subtle but important inversion. There's also a manufacturing layer underneath all of this that often gets reduced to China has scale advantage, which is technically true but incomplete. The lithium iron phosphate LFP supply chain is the quiet backbone here. It is cheaper, more stable thermally, and well suited for stationary storage. Chinese firms didn't just adopt LFP, they industrialized it to the point where cost curves dropped below what most European procurement frameworks assumed was even possible. That cost compression didn't just increase deployment, it changed project economics entirely. Suddenly, storage wasn't a premium grid add-on. It became a default engineering assumption in many provinces. Europe's procurement environment, by contrast, is still shaped by higher capital costs, slower permitting, and a more fragmented industrial base. Even when European utilities want to scale storage aggressively, they are often constrained by permitting timelines that stretch across multiple regulatory layers: municipal, national, and sometimes EU-level coordination. That friction isn't dramatic in isolation, it just accumulates. And accumulation is what energy systems are built on. There's a counterpoint worth taking seriously here. Europe's slower build-out has forced more experimentation at the system level: virtual power plants, demand response aggregation, and market-driven flexibility services. Some of those innovations could outperform hardware-heavy models over time, especially if battery chemistry or pricing shifts again. But they are still layered on top of a grid that was not originally designed for this kind of internal dynamism. China didn't have that legacy constraint in the same way when it accelerated deployment. It could redesign while scaling. One detail that often gets missed: storage in China is increasingly co-located with renewable generation in industrial clusters that are designed as export engines, provinces whose economic output depends on stable, predictable electricity. That means storage is not just about energy transition goals. It is about industrial continuity. Factories don't tolerate volatility. And once storage becomes a requirement for output stability, It stops being optional infrastructure. So the question shifts slightly, not who has more storage, but what is storage protecting? In China, it is protecting industrial throughput and grid expansion at the same time. In Europe, it is still largely protecting grid balance in a system that is already stretched across national boundaries and legacy infrastructure. Those are not equivalent roles, even if the megawatts start to look similar on paper. At some point, comparing China and Europe purely through installed storage capacity stops being useful. The numbers still matter, but they start hiding as much as they reveal. Because the deeper issue is not how much storage exists, it's how predictable the system is allowed to be. China's grid planning assumes something Europe still treats as a market outcome: coordinated behavior across generation, storage, and demand. That sounds abstract until you look at curtailment data. In several Chinese provinces, renewable curtailment rates have fallen significantly over the past few years, even as capacity has expanded rapidly. That only happens when storage and transmission expansion are not lagging behind generation growth. But there's a tension inside that success. Battery storage at scale introduces a second-order problem. It changes pricing signals. When storage smooths volatility, it also flattens scarcity. And when scarcity is flattened, market signals that normally guide investment become less clear. China is effectively solving a physical problem, intermittency, while quietly rewriting how price discovery behaves inside its power system. That's not a small adjustment. That's structural redesign of incentives. Europe faces the opposite tension. Its price signals are extremely sharp. During energy shocks, like the 2022 gas crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, electricity prices in parts of Europe spiked to levels that forced immediate behavioral and policy responses. That volatility creates investment urgency, but it also creates political friction. Storage deployment becomes one of several competing answers, not the central organizing principle. And this is where the comparison gets uncomfortable. China's system can absorb overbuilding because coordination is centralized. Europe cannot absorb overbuilding as easily because coordination is distributed. So Europe tends to optimize for flexibility and optionality, while China can optimize for throughput and scale. There's a data point that illustrates this imbalance without needing exaggeration. According to multiple energy transition trackers, including Bloomberg NEF's 2024 outlooks, China is responsible for a majority share of global battery manufacturing capacity and a rapidly growing share of stationary storage deployment as well. Europe is still heavily dependent on imported cells and modules, even when final system integration happens domestically. That dependency doesn't just affect cost, it affects pacing. But here's where the story gets less clean. Europe's fragmentation is also a form of resilience. If one policy regime fails or shifts direction, it doesn't necessarily collapse the entire system trajectory. Germany can adjust differently from Spain. France can lean on nuclear baseload while others expand renewables. That diversity slows convergence, but it also reduces systemic lock-in risk. China, by contrast, is betting on coherence. When it works, it scales fast. When it misfires, corrections have to propagate through a tightly coupled system, and storage sits right in the middle of that trade-off. I'm not fully convinced that either model is universally superior. The data supports China's speed advantage, but it also raises a quieter question. How stable is a system when its optimization logic is centrally aligned across so many interdependent layers? There's another angle people often miss, and I think it's important here. Storage isn't just absorbing renewable volatility, it's also absorbing policy volatility. When coal output changes, when renewable quotas shift, when regional demand planning updates, batteries smooth the transition between policy decisions and physical reality. That makes them politically powerful in a way most infrastructure never is. So the real comparison is not infrastructure versus infrastructure. It's whether stability is being manufactured through coordination or through markets reacting to stress. And those two logics don't converge easily. even if the grid statistics sometimes suggest they do. If you strip away the geopolitical framing, the simplest way to understand this is almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. China didn't beat Europe in battery storage because it had better engineers or better chemistry. It treated storage as part of industrial policy execution. Europe treated it as part of energy transition management. Same technology, different mental model of what the grid is supposed to do. That difference compounds quietly until it becomes visible in megawatts. What I keep coming back to is this. Storage is no longer just about balancing renewables. That was the original story, and it's still partly true. But once penetration passes a certain threshold, storage starts acting like a control layer for the entire economic system underneath the grid. Industrial uptime, price stability, even regional development planning. China is already operating in that phase in multiple provinces. Not uniformly, not perfectly, but enough to matter statistically. The grid is becoming something closer to a managed industrial platform than a negotiated market. Europe is not there yet, and I don't say that as a criticism. It's a consequence of how European integration was built. Bottom-up coordination, cross-border negotiation, and policy layering over decades of existing infrastructure. That structure produces stability in one sense, but it slows system redesign in another. And that trade-off is now showing up in storage deployment curves. There's a risk in overstating China's advantage here. Scale can hide inefficiencies. Central coordination can misallocate just as easily as it can accelerate deployment. I've seen enough energy systems analysis to know that fast build-outs often carry hidden correction cycles later. Overcapacity in some regions, underutilization in others, pricing distortions that only become visible when demand patterns shift. But even with those caveats, the direction of travel is hard to ignore. Battery storage in China is not waiting for a future energy transition. It is already embedded in the current one, shaping how coal plants ramp, how renewables are dispatched, and how industrial clusters maintain output stability under variable supply conditions. Europe's system is moving toward that same logic, but through a different path. More distributed control, more market-based signals, more gradual layering of flexibility tools. The question is whether gradualism keeps pace with the physical speed of renewable expansion. Here's where my own reading settles, at least for now. I think China's advantage is real in deployment speed and system integration, but I also think it comes with a hidden dependency. The assumption that coordination remains effective as complexity scales. That's not guaranteed indefinitely. Large, tightly coupled systems can remain efficient for a long time until they suddenly aren't. Europe's advantage is the opposite. Slower integration, but more independent adjustment points. Less elegant, more forgiving when parts of the system diverge. So I don't see a simple winner. I see two different answers to the same problem, both incomplete in their own way. One prediction I'm fairly comfortable making. Storage stops being a clean energy technology story within the next decade. It becomes a grid governance story. Whoever controls the timing layer of electricity, not just production, starts influencing industrial geography in ways we still underestimate. And that leads to a question I don't have a clean answer for yet. If batteries are now the layer that decides when electricity is real or not in economic terms, then what exactly are we comparing when we say one grid is bigger than another? Because the answer might not be capacity anymore. It might be control over time itself.